followers of the king of the Banda Islands, his warriors jumped out and they massacred Berhoff and 46 Dutchmen. The other parties, dozens of other Dutchmen, escaped by the skin of their teeth by rushing back to their ships, including a young merchant by the name of Jan Peterson Cohen, and we'll talk about him.
James.
Hi.
Anne, how are you?
Good.
Good. Long time no see. How are you?
Yeah, it has been a long time. How are you?
Good. I'm good. Let me just go ahead and share it on the Facebook. A lot of people following us on the Facebook. How's things in DC?
Well, they've been very beautiful. Today we had a blast of winter ending up, but you know, just the end of winter because the spring is here. How about New York?
DC is a beautiful country. I love DC. I mean,
City.
Sorry, city, and I particularly love Washington.
Yeah, it is a beautiful city. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, for my money, I think it's more beautiful than New York. New York is just very busy. And
New York is New York. New York is, you know,
there used to be a joke when we came to this country. They used to say, New York is not the United States. You know?
Well, I always say it's planet New York. It's a world unto itself.
It's a world on itself, yeah. While Washington is just beautiful, especially when you go to the White House and Capitol, and then you visit the park. It's just blows your mind.
Well, this time of year, it's really gorgeous. You know, we've got the cherry blossoms blossoming and all the tulips and daffodils and all sorts of things. So yeah, it is gorgeous. So it's your tax dollars at work. Come down and visit.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, my tax dollars in work right now. Thank God we're getting the vaccine. That's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Have you gotten your vaccine?
I got first shot, a week ago. I'm getting my second on the 14th. What about you?
Yeah, they say the second one is kind of rough. Did you have much trouble with the first one?
Are you Pfizer or Moderna?
Oh, I've forgotten which one, to tell you the truth.
Oh, okay.
But
yeah, first one was easy. My daughter got one in Pittsburgh. She says that first of all, she's hyperallergenic, so I was worried. Yesterday, I had her friend stay with her. She felt very tired, and then she fell asleep.
Yeah, that's the symptoms.
Her arm hurt. My arm didn't hurt. I was doing push-up the next day.
I'm impressed, Zach. I'm very impressed. Yeah, I mean, it's meant to stimulate your antibodies, so it makes you it's going to give you a little kick for sure.
Correct. It is, so what I did, and I'll let you share whenever you want to share, is up to you. But
okay.
You can give it a couple of minutes if you want.
Sure, let's give it a couple of minutes. I've got about 45 slides, so it'll probably take me about, half hour and a half to get through. As I've said, I'll say in the beginning, I usually don't even look at the chat, I don't even bother with that. I kind of just rip through my presentation. And if something's glaringly wrong, I'll be happy to answer questions. So as we go along. Yeah.
Oh, Ralph is here. We had one yesterday too, interesting one too, where, Muslim relationship with Vikings, which it's not something that we've experienced or known that Al-Andalusia had a relationship with Vikings, but then yesterday was like an eye opener for us. It was interesting. I posted on the YouTube channel, so if you have a chance to look at
I do. I always look at the YouTube things because a lot of times I just can't, the schedule doesn't work, but I always say to myself, not to worry, I can watch the YouTube channel.
That's why I put it in there. And I should really have make it more kind of like, talk about what the subject matter is all about. So whoever's new coming in, they kind of know, like if I say Al-Andalusia, people should, it's in Muslim Spain, stuff like, sometimes it's not glaring. Like yesterday we were talking about Bulgars, and a lot of people know who Bulgars were, it's
Right.
Volga Bulgars were, in Russia, and, there were, a Muslim nation in that region, and then yesterday Greg was talking about how their language is lost. We're thinking of Bulgars as like Bulgaria, has nothing to do with, those are Slavic names.
No, it's a different thing.
Yeah, we should do one on Bulgars one day, I think, as well. Which we
There
did.
are,
Go ahead, sorry.
there's so many topics.
I'm telling you, I never get enough. Yesterday,
No.
Joshua, was talking to me. I was like, Zach, where do you have time for all this? They're like, I have great people that are presenting here. I'm not the only one presenting. So it's, it's always.
Oh, wow, that would be a challenge.
Well, I have actually three. I have one this Saturday, just a piece, Marika.
Wow.
He's going to do one on that philosophy of Greek philosophy. And we're going to have Hadrian come in. He's going to talk about how the Greeks saw the world. And I'm going to talk about the having horses, which is the interaction of Chinese and Hellenistic culture, which is, not something that everybody heard about. Just like kind of yesterday's topic. And I want to talk about this unique topic sometimes.
Well, that's great. That's great.
Michael is here. Marika is here. People are trickling in.
Ava's here.
Ava is here. Ava, sorry.
You know what's been rather unusual? My virtual trips, which I love so much. I was in Sri Lanka. And reason I'm bringing this up is the Dutch West Company. And for instance, I didn't know that the Portuguese came in and then they had a fight with the Dutch. But the Portuguese.
Eva, we just, sometimes we don't want to jump ahead. I think.
Okay.
the biggest topic of this.
Sorry.
Don't steal my thunder, Ava.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm just teasing you.
No, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you'll see where we'll kind of circle around to that point too.
Sorry, I'm not trying to be rude. I just, I apologize.
My apologies. I
No.
do like my virtual tours, and
Yeah, definitely.
That sounds like fun.
it is, and it's all live. And I was in Paris at night today
Wow.
with do you know that they light up the Eiffel Tower to twinkle
No
every
way.
hour for 5 minutes,
Interesting.
and to do these tours at night because it's in lockdown after 7. So the Champs-Élysées, there was nobody. And I took all these images.
Yeah, I have my famous singer. His name is Charles Aznavour. He would sing in the song Champs-Élysées. Mikhail knows about this song. You know that song, Mikhail?
What? Which one?
Charles Aznavour, Champs-Élysées.
Yeah.
Oh, Champs-Élysées. Do-do-do-do-do.
But I cannot sing. But I know.
My mother always played Thank Heavens for Little Girls. That was by him, right?
Charles Boyer.
Yes.
Yes.
I can't sing either, but
Yes, well, you made a
it was
good
it was
attempt.
an interesting singer. His name is I'm talking about Mikhail. He was a
Yes.
very famous chansonnier in France. What's his name? The French singer who was from United States. Due to the McCarthy rule, his father was shipped to
Not
Paris.
Charles Aznavour.
No, not Charles Aznavour. His name is he sings about Indian summer.
It's not Roy Orbison. Orbison was banned.
No. I'll tell you right now. Sorry. Thank God to Google.
Yes, I know. Oh,
Google doesn't know. Google doesn't know.
Hey, Ann,
Yeah.
this is Mark. Do I remember correctly? Are you the one who did the CIA?
Yeah.
That was really good.
Well, thank you, Mark.
I remember.
Thank you.
It's Joe Dassin. Joe Dassin.
Oh,
Yeah.
Joe Dassin was actually, his father was an American, and his grandfather was a Jewish barber in New York. And due to
Oh.
McCarthy law, he had to immigrate. His father had to immigrate with his son to France, and he became one of the most famous French chansonnier singer. His name is Joe Dassin. In the United States, they call him Joe Dassin. Is a Russian last name, but he's a Mikhail knows, in Russia we used to, that's all we listen to is
Yeah. Why are you talking about him? I missed the beginning.
He's talking about
Paris.
in general, and he talks about a lot about Paris. It's his songs about Paris, and he was around the time, maybe a little later than Charles Aznavour, maybe 10-15 years later, but still, it's an interesting story about him. So I want to do at some point, we're moving a little bit. We also have some musical pieces. We're going to have a music in medieval time. I want to do
Oh.
an interesting musician, his biography. It would be interesting.
Okay, then in natural procession, we should go to dancers and talk about Rodolphe Nureyev and Mikhail Baryshnikov speaking about Russian dancers.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rodolphe Nureyev, I visit his grave in Paris. It's interesting. He actually is a descendant of the noble family, Tartar noble family that converted to Christianity. And he was gay, and then he moved to Paris in the 70s, right? And
yeah, he defected
he attracted him to Paris, and he was an amazing dancer, and he died of cancer, brain cancer. Yeah, and he has a beautiful grave in Paris. It's
Sorry,
amazing.
Mikhail, it was all Ava's fault for starting all this.
No, it's fine. Just in case it's Ava's fault with everything.
Well, good. You get excited about, like, we're in total lockdown now again, like total.
You see, that's why I have all these things for you guys, so that you can log in, enjoy our topics.
But then speaking of other arts, we should talk about poetry. And we have Joseph
Yes.
Brodsky, who was a Nobel laureate, and also he was American poet laureate for a year, nominated by George Bush the Elder.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I mean, we have so many topics to talk about. It's crazy. I haven't touched on. I want to keep it to the history for now, but we definitely do dive into other topics. Poetry would be one of those as well, but we also need, if you guys have any topics you want to talk about, let me know, because I hate to put the topics on and then there's like nobody there to present.
Nobody's there.
And then Zach is talking about Nureyev and and poetry and everything else, and and unfortunately I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, so just learn. All right, couple more minutes, and it's supposed to be 20 people. I just reported what's going on.
Yeah. We all are not experts. We are actually some of us know much better, some of us worse. But
Well, you clearly love poetry, so if you want to volunteer,
I cannot say clearly love poetry. I love some poetry. Yeah, devoted some time to this. Yeah.
sure.
Did I catch you saying that you were using there's a program on ancient music or on the instruments?
No, we're gonna do one on medieval music with Jonathan that presented on the ancient weaponry and armor. His wife is a musician, and she's a teacher of music, and she volunteered to do medieval music. And I'm hoping we're gonna get some concerto. If not, at least we'll listen to some of the stuff. But in medieval time, you have Bach. You have all these people that's clearing into that time. So it's interesting to. It's like mostly you can think of it as music appreciation, medieval style. So.
Yeah, my brother, it used to be the chairman of the Academy of Ancient Music in London, and they do a lot of their main thing actually is to play on the original instruments.
Yeah, I mean, if your brother wants to do a piece, let me know. we have precautions, and then, I definitely, I could, bust out something like dutar, Indian dutar thing, and I'll give it a try. I used to play guitar. Maybe it's close.
Yeah, so did I. Still have my 12 string and my 6 string
Here we go.
and a violin.
We'll do a little history concerto here, trio, or whatever else.
You have the Kiwanis Festival down there, don't you? The
Yes.
music festival? Because I was on the board of directors for the Kiwanis Music Festival in Toronto.
Damn. Wow. You like the jack of all trades, Ava. Sorry.
Well, you're only here on this earth for one time, so.
And you want to start then, maybe?
Sure. And let me just mention, Zach, occasionally my malware scanner kicks me off, but don't worry, I always come back within about 15 seconds. So just wait for a minute and I'll be back, okay? In case that happens.
No problem.
Okay. Well, here we go. Ready? Tonight, I'm going to share some thoughts about the Dutch East and West Indies companies. And it's basically a story of profit and pirates and plunder. What I wanted to do was kind of make a little bit of a connection. This is a famous artist of the time by the name of Hendrik Cornelis Vroom, which is my last name. Now, according to the laws of 7 degrees of separation, you all are probably as related to Hendrik Vroom as I am. I just happen to carry the surname. But we'll see several of his paintings depicting this period when the Dutch East India Company was established. What I'm going to share tonight are a couple of stories. One will be a story about the establishment of the Dutch East and West Indies companies. Then talk a little bit about the actual Dutch East Indies company's trade routes to the Far East, and then of course over here towards North and South America. Then a story about the Dutch East Indies, the more tragic side of their experience, which was the widespread enslavement and abuse of indigenous people. Then a story about the real pirates of the Dutch Indies companies, and specifically about an episode that's referred to as Zilvervloed. And I don't speak Dutch, but I've got a feeling that's about silver and about loot. And finally, a little bit about the New Netherlands and New Amsterdam, which, as I have here, is otherwise known as New York, as you all would say it, Zach. So, brief overview about the Dutch East India Company. The name in Dutch is, I can't say this correctly, Verenigde. Anyone who's a linguist out there could probably do it better than I. However, the initials VOC, very often one will see the Dutch East India Company referred to as the VOC, and that's because of the original Dutch name. The VOC was chartered by the States General of the Netherlands to carry on trade and colonial activities in Asia. Very shortly, really about the same time, and we'll talk about this some more, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was established. And then in the 1606, they issued their first joint stock offering, which was supposedly the first joint stock offering in European history. So a lot about the Dutch East India Company concerns the financial arrangements that it represented, many of which were rather innovative in the financial history of Europe at that time.
And I am sorry, isn't it in the human history the first joint stock offering? I can't imagine that somebody else had it before Europe.
Well, I agree. we'll see that at almost the same time, the British started what was known as the British East India Company. And in a way, that was a partnership kind of arrangement as well. But you're right. I suspect that was one of the issue is, how is that different from just a regular partnership arrangement? Because there's been partnerships, financial partnerships to launch business enterprises forever. It's talked about in the Bible.
My limited knowledge in this tells me that English company British company was sponsored by the state, by the empire, and Amsterdam company, it was a real clear case of first joint stock offering. Yeah,
I think that's right. We'll talk about that because we're going to look at the actual charter of the Dutch East India Company and pick out some of the unique points of that charter. In any event, once they got chartered and started doing business, the East India Company set up trade routes, engaged in trade primarily around the Horn of Africa and towards Indonesia and that area of the world. They had two, it's a polite word to say, forceful governors general at that time, about whom we'll hear some more. One was this John Cohen, and another was Anthony Demon. And basically, their claim to fame was, aside from establishing their foothold all over that area of the world, they also counteracted both the Portuguese and British influence. So those three major powers were all vying for this trade activity. At the same time, one of their explorers headed out across the Atlantic, and Henry Hudson, who was employed by the Dutch East India Company, was the first one to come up the Hudson River, of course, thinking it was the Northeast Passage to India. Jumping way ahead, they were ultimately dissolved in 1799. So again, this is just an overview. We'll get into several details of these various points. This is a little bit of an overview about the Dutch West India Company. They were established about 20 years after the Dutch East India Company. And their charter was for a trade monopoly in what was called the Dutch West Indies. And again, they were not only a trading organization, but they were also an administrator of places where they set down trade bases. These trade bases in various parts of the world essentially became Dutch colonies. And instead of the Netherlands government, the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, sending out government representatives to run these places, they simply let either the Dutch or East or West India Company representatives do it. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company sponsored the first 30 families that arrived in North America in Manhattan. And in 1628, and again, we'll talk about this when we talk about pirates, the Dutch seaman, Admiral Peter Heine, captured an entire Spanish fleet off of Cuba in 1688, which had such a rich booty that it slightly affected the entire course of European economics at that time. Again, now they were less successful. They were supposed to branch out to places like Brazil and all of Latin America. They were much less successful in that region of the world than the Dutch East India Company was in the Southeast Asia area of the world. And so they were ultimately dissolved, and a second Dutch, as being not as financially successful. And a second, yeah.
That ship that was captured by the Dutch that you mentioned, that big one, was that the black ship by chance?
The black ship?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I'm sure there was a black ship that was caught because piracy was part of the business model for the Dutch West India Company. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yes.
question. Why is there a reason why the West India Company didn't do so well and they abandoned and they went to the other side? I mean, or the East India Company was doing very well, but the West, why they didn't put more? I mean,
more assets into making the Dutch West India Company successful, do you mean?
Right. Yeah. Why they didn't try?
I think because the Portuguese and the Spanish had a stronger foothold, particularly in Latin America, than they had in Southeast Asia. And so the Dutch simply couldn't break into that trade pattern as well.
By the way, I might just add, yes, it wasn't just Spain and Portugal. The British, when the Dutch settled New Amsterdam, the British were settling the Massachusetts Bay Colony and in Virginia, and the British were very much heavily involved in the Caribbean. So the British were also a big challenge. And
That's right.
The Dutch is too small a country to challenge the British. And I guess the French were involved too. So the Dutch just was too small.
Yeah, they just couldn't get the footholds that they got in Southeast Asia, bottom line. So they shuttered, and a second Dutch West India Company went into effect, which rather than being this sort of quasi-governmental enterprise was strictly a commercial organization dealing in trade and the transatlantic slave trade, the commodity trade, and also just bringing people to New Amsterdam and New Netherlands and the area up there around the Hudson River. Ultimately, they, like the Dutch East India Company, were dissolved near the end of the 18th century. So that's kind of the overview. We were talking about the British East India Company. I wanted to just say that apparently a lot of people had East India companies. One was England, Holland had one. Well, Holland, obviously, as we're talking about, France, Denmark, Scotland, Spain, Austria, Sweden. They also all had some sort of endeavors that entailed engaging in lucrative trade points throughout Southeast Asia. It was a spice trade, it was a slave trade, and it was, as we'll see, what would we say now? Luxury goods trade, porcelains from China, pearls, jewels, all of that sort of bling that Europe was beginning to highly enjoy having imported and having access to. In the case of the British East India Company, which was probably the largest correlate to the Dutch East and West companies, the English, that survived well past the two Dutch companies into the mid-19th century. The way it worked out as between the English and the Dutch in Southeast Asia was in 1623, after a series of skirmishes back and forth around various points in Southeast Asia, the English basically withdrew from Indonesia and limited itself to India, which of course is limiting yourself to a huge region. But nevertheless, they kind of came, the Dutch and the English kind of came to a détente as to their respective spheres of trade and diplomatic influence in that area. So at any event, simply to say that everybody had various enterprises, joint partnership enterprises for outfitting ships to sail away to the Far East buy and trade for all these luxury items as well as spices and engage in the slave trade, etc., and make money for their investors, as well as extend and assure the respective diplomatic, political, military spheres of influence of the countries they represented.
And
Yes.
sorry,
yes.
question.
Yeah.
I always was very curious why slaves came from Africa. What was the distinction that they take slaves from Africa, not from India, not from Jakarta, not from other places? How do they, and who do they put in their colonies to control the population or to keep the trade going? I mean, there were not so many Netherlandish people to stay in all over these colonies. So who kept control of all these colonies?
Well, I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. There's two aspects of that sort of hideous trade in humans. One is slave labor, and the other is actual slave trade. The Dutch engaged in a lot of slave labor in Southeast Asia of indigenous populations. And so I really don't know the answer to that, but just speculating, I suspect that the various estates that they, basically plantations that they established throughout the island network of particularly Indonesia were large enough to absorb all the indigenous population that they were enslaving to work on these plantations. I think there was less of that agricultural development in the trade hubs that were established in Africa. And so there, they were simply abducting people and shipping them off to other places where they needed supplemental slave labor for these large plantations, which was not only Southeast Asia, but they also, of course, abducted and forced people to Latin America and America. So, yeah, so I think it wasn't that they didn't enslave indigenous populations in Southeast Asia. It was that they kept them in place as slave labor without, transporting them to other areas, because that's where they had these large estates, farms, plantations, etc.
Yes, I could comment
That
on
makes
that.
sense.
Yes, I think you're right. In the Americas, the indigenous population was, first of all, it was mostly wiped out by diseases, so there weren't that many of them. And the American indigenous people just were not really susceptible to slave labor. And of course, Africa was fairly easy for ships to bring slaves in from Africa. This was called the triangular trade, where the European traders would take cloth and tools and things of that sort, sell them in Africa. Africans didn't have that much to sell to Europe, but they had slaves to sell. And the Europeans generally did not directly capture slaves. They bought slaves from African slave traders. They transported them over to the Americas, where they would get indigo and ship tars and timbers and things from the Americas, and that would go back to England. So there wasn't really much of a two-way trade between any of these, but that triangular trade proved very profitable. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a good addition to the thought, Ralph. It was a chilling turn of events when they went into that business, for sure. In any event, I wanted to do just a brief flyover of the history of the Netherlands, so you'll have some idea of where the Dutch were. Let's see, I think we got somebody that needs to be on mute. Ah, good. Yeah, Zach? let's see.
Zach
Okay,
is mute, someone else.
Yeah, let me see.
Yeah.
Hold on a second. So
Yeah.
what's going on? You getting another voice?
yeah, not anymore, not right now. It's good now. So at any rate, I wanted to do a brief flyover the history of the Netherlands so that you would have some context for what was going on among the Dutch at the time of the establishment of the East and West Indies companies. Real quickly, the Dutch derive from a tribe of probably Germanic peoples called the Frisians. That's what they were referred to in Roman accounts. Jumping fast forward, Charlemagne Empire included what was then referred to as the Netherlands, the lowlands. That at the time included Belgium and what we now call Holland or the Netherlands. In 1083, the name Holland first appears. Holland is actually, as we'll see, one of the 7 united Netherlands Republic states. Then we get into the period where you know the mutual animosities begin to originate, the international animosities. First, from 1384 to 1482, known as the Burgundian period, most of the Netherlands was under the rule of the French Duke of Burgundy. Then the power shifted to the Habsburgs, and the Netherlands found itself included in the Habsburg Empire. But then in 1658, the thing about the Habsburg Empire is that it switched to being under the rule of King Philip II of Spain. And King Philip II of Spain started to assert, I think, whereas prior, under the Burgundian period and the earlier Habsburg period, the rule over the Dutch had been relatively light-handed. Philip, however, who was building the Spanish Empire at that time, started to weigh in on how he wanted things to go in the Netherlands, and he encountered resistance. And that was the start in 1568 of something we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, but the 80 Years' War, which was as between the Spanish and the Dutch. And originally that was local in the Netherlands, and it was religiously based. The Netherlands at that point were Protestants, they were Calvinists, and Philip was determined that everybody within his empire was going to be Catholic. And that just led to bloodshed. And ultimately, once the Dutch declared themselves a separate republic and got their feet on the ground, that clash is what extended out to Southeast Asia, and then, of course, westward towards the Americas. In any event, in 1581, the Dutch actually simply declared their independence from Spain in the course of the conflict, and organized what became known as the Republic of the 7 United Netherlands. And we'll talk about what those 7 entities were. Just to give the whole arc of the narrative for the Dutch, in 1648, the 80 Years' War finally came to an end, and the Dutch were at that point fully recognized as an independent republic within that otherwise monarchical regime that controlled the rest of Europe. In 1652, they had some altercation with the English until their King William of Orange and Queen Mary went over from the Netherlands and became the King of England. That kind of made a détente relationship as between the two countries. And then in the latter part of the 19th century, they had some disputes with their neighbor France, And up until when Napoleon made his brother the king of the Netherlands. And then after Napoleon had his rise and fall, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands is declared again, which at that point included Belgium, and there were two capitals, Brussels and Amsterdam. And then in 1830, Belgium broke away, and we were left with what is basically today the Republic of the Netherlands. So that's the big key here, is that in the early formation and developmental years of the two Dutch Indies companies, those companies and the way they operated very much reflected this 80-year engagement of war with the Spanish and ultimately and the Portuguese as well. So to drill down on the 80 Years' War a little, as I mentioned, it was religious. It was the Dutch Protestants versus the Spanish Catholics. At the outset of the war, the Netherlands, again, this was just a loose geographical designation almost, the lower lands. In the 1500s, was a patchwork of sort of aristocratic fiefdoms known as gewesten, which stretched from the north all the way to the French border and included Belgium and Luxembourg. And it was part of the Catholic Spanish Empire. But then the Dutch nobles, led by William of Orange, asked the local Spanish powers to back off, basically. Let them be Protestants and, you know, have that religious dispute simmer down to more of an equilibrium. Unfortunately, the Spanish did not reciprocate and continued the persecution of Protestants. The Dutch Protestants pushed back, started smashing up Catholic churches in the south part of the Netherlands. And it went back and forth like that for you know, that latter quarter of the 1500s. One of the big turning points where everything got really serious was the Spanish were having trouble paying their troops that they had stationed around the Netherlands, and the troops proceeded to mutineer and ransacked Antwerp. And in at least by the, you know, the legendary history of it, they killed 8,000 people and burned down most of the town. That's a painting of whatever horror that may have been. This, of course, only ultimately, this completely solidified the Dutch opposition to the Spanish. And there was a determined united front. And at that time in 1588, this fellow, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, and his supporters not only decided they would have a republic, but that they didn't need a king at all, that they would be ruled by something called the Staten General, which was a federation of the seven component areas, of seven of the component areas, and you know, reorganization of that original 17 Gewesten. And then that raged on because, of course, the war with, just because the Dutch declared themselves a republic, the Spanish did not cease trying to assert their authority. And that went on until the mid part of the 17th century, when there was a Treaty of Munster in 1648, and Spain simply recognized the republic. So within this context of emerging Republican independence is the kind of overall gestalt in which the Dutch East India companies emerged. And I included this series of maps, and I'll have a lot of maps because the Dutch are famous for their maps. Not that these are all Dutch maps, but that's how they kind of thought, what seems like, was in terms of maps. This map, of course, shows you generally that the Netherlands are, you know, in the midst of all that dispute with the Spanish and organizing themselves into the Dutch United Republic, was, you know, a relatively small little patch of ground in Europe. And I mean, yeah, in Western Europe. And they were even smaller patch of ground taken in the context of the globe. However, they had a remarkable self-image. This is an image that you see in a lot of prints of that time. And it's basically taking the geography of the seven United States of the Netherlands Republic and configuring it into this Belgic lion, Leo Belgicus. So these were a tough and feisty people with a determination to be independent and to make their way onto the global stage, which is what they did. This, of course, also is a period that's the period of the 1600s is what's referred to, or has been in the typical historical narrative up to this point, as the golden age of the Dutch golden age. You know, we have all the great artists, Rembrandt, etc. There are numerous philosophers, the architecture, as we'll see, the trade structures. That narrative is changing a little bit because historians are now doing a fuller scope of narrative where they include in all the things like, the enslavement of the indigenous populations that the Dutch encountered in their trade empire building. And so it's coming down now to more of a golden age for who? It was the people of the Netherlands doing a lot of exploiting of other people for whom it was far from a golden age. But at the time, they had their notion of identity, and you can see that identity was, and this was a very famous image. It was people sewed it on their clothes and made, coverlets with this on it, etc. It's very reflective of a spirit, and of course, it was a young, new, emergent country. I think there was, might be a little much to call it a nation state at that point, but they had a very definite sense of identity and independence from the traditional structure of Western European empire.
Can I just ask a quick question? I mean,
Yeah,
today, Flemish and Dutch are virtually the same language, or at least the people I know can speak to each other in a single language. So are the Flemish people really the descendants of the Spanish Catholics that you pointed to?
The Spanish Catholics, well, certainly the southern part of the Netherlands, which the Netherlands as it had been under the Spanish Empire and the Habsburg Empire, etc., included what's called, and you'll see that here on this map in the far left bottom corner, the southern, I think that Oostermeijerjisk Nederlanden means southern Netherlands. And that was sort of a zone between Catholic France and Catholic France now and the Dutch, the Protestant Netherlands. And yeah, that is where where Catholicism was still the prevailing religion among the population themselves. It wasn't just imposed. So yeah, the Flemish, I agree with you. I've heard the two languages. Not that I understand them, but they are very similar. And of course, some current Belgians speak what the Belgians in the north, it's more adjacent to the Netherlands, speak what they characterize as Dutch rather than French. So yeah, linguistically, it's very similar. And probably, heritage-wise as well, except for that religious difference.
All right, thank
So
you.
that's a good point. This is just a map of who were the 7 united components of the Republic. And as you can see, there was Friesland, Drenthe, Gelderland, Utrecht, Zeeland, which is to the south there, Middelburg is as far south as it went. I primarily, and that there's a little point there where Der Haag, that's The Hague, and that was where the Confederation government of the Confederation federal part of the governmental structure resided. I primarily included this because I know it's confusing. It's like people talk about Holland and then they talk about the Netherlands and it's like the Dutch. It's like, what is all that? Well, Holland was in essence a part of the Netherlands as it presently is today, and the biggest part. And Amsterdam is in Holland. So, I mean, Holland kind of becomes synonymous with the Netherlands, but historically, it was only one of the seven component states. They had a federal structure, very much like our federal structure, in the sense that each of these states had independent governments of their own, and then there was a federal organization called the States General that was seated at The Hague, which was the equivalent of Washington, D.C. for the Dutch Republic. So that's to, for the purpose of primarily sort of pointing that all out. Now, next I want to sort of get more focused on this economic phenomenon. I pulled this quote because I thought it was a good summary. This particular historian encapsulated it that in just over 100 years, the provinces of the northern Netherlands, which are the provinces that comprised that united Netherlands Republic, as opposed to the southern part that stayed separate and more Catholic, went from relative obscurity as the poor cousins of the industrious and heavily urbanized southern Netherlands, the Flemish, provinces of Flanders and Brabant, to the pinnacle of European commercial success. And he summarizes it that they took advantage of a favorable agricultural base. The regions, even though they're basically lowlands, they're very fertile, and the inhabitants were very good at developing farms, producing more on those farms than they needed. So they always had trade to export, their dairy industry, all the same things we think about today when we think about the Dutch. They also, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But all this power, all this development was based on the richness that came out of the colonies. I mean, it was a lot of money coming in, a lot of, with the trade and the slave and everything. And that's what made possible all this development. It's not that they were.
Well, apparently that's true. However, before they even expanded out their trade empire to the extent they did, they were a prosperous little region. They supported themselves very well. And as I said, they produced surplus, agricultural surplus, dairy surplus, and they were canny business people. So they were actually exporting to other European and Scandinavian countries from their own regional base. But you're right, the jump into being the golden age was, of course, when they started their global trade empire. But that global trade empire grew out of this secure economic base, which, as you see in the second part of this quote, he mentions not only the agricultural base, but there was a fishing industry that they engaged in the Baltic and the North Sea. And then, of course, as you point out correctly, Maritza, it blew up into a huge thing. But the basic base was that, you had a very industrious culture, and they made the most of what they had, and then they started optimizing their surplus. And which brings up this sort of idea of, was there a particular Dutch culture, shall we say, a certain Dutch cultural identity? And there's a whole lot to be said on that, as there is for any group's cultural identity. But this is a book I've read by a fellow by the name of Simon Schema, a historian. He's kind of a cultural sociological historian. He's done several books, but he makes the interesting point that, for example, he says that the center of the Dutch world is a burgher, not a bourgeois. And he makes a distinction that a burgher was a citizen first and a homo economist second. In other words, a burgher in the Netherlands was not just a certain socioeconomic class. A burgher was any citizen of Holland considered themselves part of the Dutch economic machine, really, as a citizen. And as he puts it, it was a yin and a yang. The obligations, the civic obligations, condition the opportunities of prosperity. In other words, if they all work together, they would become more prosperous, and the more prosperous they got, the more reason to work together. It was just a dynamic that worked. In some ways, you can analogize it to Japan, where everybody sort of has a Japan Inc. or had a Japan Inc. kind of mentality. And this was the Netherlands Inc. It's as though everyone was not only an inhabitant of the Netherlands, they were partners in the joint venture of making the Netherlands prosperous. Excuse me.
Yes, I think if we can compare, like Spain, you were talking before, Spain, England, the Dutch, how do they invest all the richness that they were coming? And Spain was becoming more and more poor, was a disaster. I think, well, the English, what they invest, these huge houses and these huge states, and what the Dutch invest was in the cities and the development, and they had a large middle class that England or Spain didn't have, or Portugal. So I think that's really a cultural and tradition thing. And also because I think the Dutch, they have all these Jewish and entrepreneurial people who were in Spain that they have to flee Spain when the Spanish queen and king were there. So they have all this great intellectual input for people that came all over the place to invest and to live in the Dutch Republic. I think that's also part of the whole thing.
Oh, no, I think that is the whole thing. That one thing is, and you mentioned, one thing about the geography of the Netherlands. The geography of the Netherlands did not lend itself to these vast country estates like you see in France, like you see in England, like you see in Germany, like you see really everywhere else in Europe. Instead, it was broken up into a patchwork of farms that were independently owned by people, middle-class people. The Netherlands were essentially middle class. And when people felt they had, an active stake in this new republic and in this republic's entrepreneurial trade ambitions, it generates an engine of prosperity. So in any event, as Shama puts it here at the very last excerpt I have from him, and that all the power and the stupendous wealth, as he characterized it, was in the end sucked into the cramped space between, these are two rivers, the Scheldt and the Ems, into the swarming beehive of fewer than 2 million people. So it was a unique moment. This clash where they had the wherewithal to declare their independence from this series of empires, the Burgundians, the Habsburgs, and the Spanish, to basically stand up and say, we're going to be an independent republic. We don't need a king. This all happened, this all coalesced. Of course, that was fueled to some extent because of the religious independence in adopting Calvinism contra Catholicism. And as you say, the diversity of the culture with large Jewish populations, and it worked for prosperity. However, Shama points out that the Dutch, however, as prosperous as they are, they always, at least the impression is that they were very sober in their prosperity. And he calls it the moral ambiguity of good fortune. He says that these were people that they found themselves through their industriousness, through their independence, becoming extremely prosperous. However, their Calvin consciences always kind of kept them a little off balance about whether this was a good thing morally. So it creates that rather unique, for lack of a better word, Dutch culture. At least the impression it leaves on one as to who the Dutch are and what their personality is like, personality taken in the broader communal sense. So anyway,
I think that,
go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
I think that religion had a lot to do in that too. I mean, Catholics at the time, if you work, that was not good. You shouldn't work. That was someone will not work, which is the opposite of what the Dutch were concerned about. You work hard, and you get riches because you work hard. So we're totally opposite ends of how they saw society.
Yeah, well, I think Catholics had a work ethic too. It's just under the Catholic monarchical regimes, the monarchs were trying to retain almost feudal economic systems, to where everybody had their station in life. And so you didn't look to change that station in life. And here come the Dutch and say, you don't have it. You don't have a assigned station in life. Life is what you make it yourself. And they were able to cooperate among themselves communally as well in these kind of enterprises. And we'll see this in this unique point in this Dutch East India Company charter, which is, recall, this was drawn up by the States General of this new Dutch Republic in 1602. They're right in the thick of the ongoing war with Spain. Now, the Dutch East Company was not the first Dutch enterprise to of a group of people getting together, pooling their money, hiring a ship, and sending the ship to go off to the Far East and hopefully bring back cargo that was sufficient to give them all a nice profit on the trip. That kind of thing had been going on prior to 1600. But they were all private enterprises. It wasn't, it obviously wasn't the Spanish, because the Dutch at that point didn't recognize Spanish overlordship. They didn't look to get a charter from King Philip of Spain to for the formation of the particular business endeavor. And so these things were kind of happening independently. What this was the first grant of a corporate charter by the new States General. And the idea was that this Dutch East India Company was private, but it was also working on behalf of the entire republic, the new republic. And both economically and when they got out to the regions of Southeast Asia, diplomatically. So it was this odd duality. This is the provision. I've just picked out a few actual excerpts from the charter. As we talked about, it was what's called in modern times a joint stock company. Now, as near as I can say, and it's usually in economic literature, economic history literature, widely bruited as the first joint stock company. However, when I kind of look at the history of the British East India Company, kind of glance through it a bit, that was a joint stock company too. The charter came from the monarch, the king or queen of England or Great Britain. And, but however, people had held share, the partners who contributed money towards a particular voyage, sending off a particular ship, or series of voyages, they had shares in the partnership. So in a way, you could say they were joint stock companies. That had been going on for hundreds of years. Venice had been doing it for hundreds of years. So why does everybody say the Dutch East India Company is the first joint stock company and the ground truth for modern corporate and entity structures? Well, in looking at the details, I think first, just to go through the steps, some of the initial provisions basically say we being the States General, the federal government of the new Dutch Republic, approve this charter. So they now are taking what had prior to that been a monarchical prerogative, as it still was in England and Spain, etc. They've said that we grant this charter on the basis of our sovereign power and authority. And of course, this is you know, their own invention. They've self-anointed themselves to have this sovereign power and authority. You know, it's obviously a predecessor to the United States Declaration of Independence. The members of the Dutch East Company, the capital for the Dutch East India Company was originally contributed in the proportions indicated by the 7 member states of the Republic. So we see here that the city of Amsterdam, on behalf of Holland, which was the biggest part of the Republic, had to ante up 1/2 of the initial capital investment. What did you need the investment for? Well, to build those ships that we just saw built and hire crew and all of that, provision the ships for getting out to where they hopefully would get the cargo to bring back for the profit. Zealand kicked in 1/4, Meuse in North Holland kicked in 1/4. So they were the level of stockholders, these governmental entities were the original stockholders to the extent that they kicked in the original capitalization. However, there was another level of opportunity for investment. That's in that bottom paragraph, the provision of the charter, which says that all residents of these united provinces shall be allowed to participate in this company. And that, I think, is the pivot. I don't think you had a provision like that in the charter for the British East India Company. I don't think you had that kind of provision in the various Venetian business enterprises, you know, and on throughout the other sovereign regions. This idea that all the citizens, all the good burghers of the Netherlands, the United Netherlands Republic, could have this investment opportunity, I think was the new idea. What it also gave rise to was, which I mentioned earlier, was the establishment of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which in parallel is considered the oldest modern securities market in the world. I don't know, I'll trust the historians when they say that. Because the thing is, when your average Dutch citizen could buy a share in the Dutch East India Company, they then had a financial instrument, that share. And so what started happening very rapidly was that you had people, once they acquired these instruments, they started trading these instruments. They started shorting some of these. They started doing all the financial games playing that's done on the New York Stock Exchange today. But that was because everyone could participate in the Dutch East Indies Company. The shareholders, and you know, I think that the other East India companies, like the British East India companies, later adopted this broader investment base from their original structure. But originally, if you were a partner shareholder in a British East India Company enterprise, I don't believe you could turn around and sell that. Not only was it not open to just anybody, it would have been whomever that inner circle of investors were. And secondly, I don't think that those investors were allowed to take their share and go publicly trade it, or, you know, do all the things that you can do when you own a publicly traded share of some corporate entity. And so this, in addition to the establishment of the Republic and the independence of United Netherlands Republic. And now this new, it's a chicken and the egg, gave rise then to this new ideas about financial democracy, let's call it, that just created a tremendous amount of prosperity. So getting to Miguel's original question, as near as I can tell, without diving too deeply into the economic and legal intricacies, I think this is why everybody always points to the Dutch East India Company charter and arrangement, together with this emergence in parallel of the concept of a stock exchange that is the beginning of modern corporate structure and finance. So that's my take on that.
And
yes, ma'am.
Ava, sort of maybe not going ahead of myself, but you're making me have a light bulb moment.
Good.
So, because I gather now, because they had all their wealth, these countries, they're sitting around saying, I don't have nothing to do. We got these boats, let's do something. So they were all going to go out and trade, like to, the India and that. Then they decided, well, they can't do it singularly. So they thought was the one thought, did they have like an economist back in those days that said, why don't we work together and form a corporation?
You mean like the monarchical governments?
Yes.
Well, they had financial advisors. I mean, Louis XIV in France had a series of advisors.
True.
But usually it seems like the only thing they were interested in was how to raise more taxes to fund armies to expand their empire.
True.
So they would basically impoverish their respective economies. They tax their people to death, which not only is strangling the engine of your own prosperity, but it's demotivating. Nobody's going to be more productive if they just know that the emperor or the king's going to come along and say, hey, you've been pretty productive, let me take that so I can go pay some of my soldiers or buy some more bling or whatever.
So they were the first world corporation that we know of.
Well, yeah, that's what everybody claims. And like I said, I think there were pieces of this happening in lots of places.
Yeah.
In Britain, in Venice, I'm sure somewhere in Russia, who knows?
Yes.
But somehow all the pieces came together at this moment in the history of the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you.
And like I said, I think the corporate financial stuff is hand in glove with that spirit of Republican independence that made them simply declare themselves a republic as against Philip of Spain, and to say not only are we going to declare our independence, but we're not going to have a king. And so all those 2 million people in that beehive that the author Sharma spoke of, the beehive that was that region, those 7 little states basically in the mud there of the lowlands, it all came together for people that were like, we've all got skin in the game of what is now the Netherlands Republic. We're all citizens of that republic. We're all burghers, participating burghers in that economic engine. Yeah. So it all worked. So this chart, another, still going through a couple of the notable provisions of the charter, aside from being a joint stock company, it was also a monopoly. It was a 21-year monopoly. That got extended, of course, but basically it said, look, unless you're operating within the framework of the Dutch East India Company, you can't just sua sponte fit up a boat and go out to the Far East and do your own thing. The Dutch East India Company is our horse in that race. So the monopoly always helps for prosperity too. They were also, as I mentioned, quasi-governmental. This was not just any business enterprise. They were authorized on behalf of the sovereign powers, such as that was of this new Dutch Republic, as it's phrased here in the charter language. And remember, this is what, 400 years ago, authorized to enter into commitments and enter into contracts with princes and rulers in the name of the States General of the United States. So this would be as though IBM became multi-global, and then the United States government said, oh, IBM, you can also start drafting treaties with other countries on our behalf. That's what this was. It was causing, when they established bases of trade in the various islands and areas of the Far East, Southeast Asia, they literally, the company appointed, quote, governors, and they were authorized to raise and keep armed forces to protect the company's interest. And since they were protecting the company's interest, they were protecting the Netherlands' interest. They were the legal system. So this was really, they became also the agents of colonization, not just in the sense of financial trade, but also in terms of governmental colonization. So the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, remember the Dutch West Company didn't get established until 25 years afterwards, after 1602. The Dutch East India Company's all set up. The Republic has been established. They've set up this new, colonial / trade entity called the Dutch East India Company, giving them all this power, and they go shipping off. Well, in the first few years, where they were just, the Portuguese, as we've said, already had a big controlling interest throughout Southeast Asia. They were there, they had trade hegemony, etc. So this new Dutch endeavor is sort of nosing its way into that neighborhood. And one of the big turning points is, and this is what I thought you might have been referring to, Mark, was what's known as the capture of the Portuguese carrack Santa Catarina. And what happened there was out in the Strait of Singapore, 3 Dutch ships woke up one morning. That's what this little story is about. And they looked around wherever they were anchored, and overnight, this gigantic Portuguese carrack, which is some kind of Portuguese ship, called the Santa Catarina, had arrived. Whereupon the admiral of the Dutch East India fleet, they had a couple of boats there, ships, I should say, decided that he had a right to attack the Santa Catarina. So this is not just doing, competitive trade activity. This is like attacking a competitor and stealing what they have, which is what they proceeded to do. He ordered his crews to attack, and like a good Dutchman, he said, be careful when you attack, because we don't want to destroy the cargo, which is what we want to steal. So no burning down the boat or anything like that. The Portuguese, who were like, what? You're attacking us? We're not a war boat. We're a trade vessel. We're completely taken surprise and surrendered. Whereupon the Dutch admiral, this fellow by the name of Heemskerk, declared ownership of the Santa Catarina and all its cargo, and everybody started heading back to the Netherlands because it was the custom, to where they were going to put all their captured cargo on sale. And the thing was, it made a big boom back in Europe because the cargo was just stunningly valuable for the times. They were coming, the Portuguese Santa Catarina was coming from, it was laden from a run to China, throughout Indonesia. As you can see, everybody was talking about it, 70 tons of gold, 1,200 bales of raw Chinese silk. There were 1,000 people on board the Carrack. Damask, all the bling you can possibly think of. It was loaded. And so here's the Dutchman. He's gotten the captain of the Carrack to surrender to being attacked, and they're coming back to the Netherlands. Well, needless to say, at some level, the establishment in Europe was saying, well, wait a minute, the Carrack was not a warship. And neither were the Dutch ships, at least eventually. On what legal basis can you appropriate their cargo and bring it back here to Europe and put it on auction for your profit and greater glory? Well, the Dutch coughed up a nice apologist for that by the name of Hugo Grotius. And Grotius is famous as basically setting up provisions of international law that are still followed today, in terms of international law theory. He wrote a lot of books, including a very famous one on the just war, which is, of course, also referred to today, even as we get into cyber warfare and things of that nature. But in this particular instance, regarding the Santa Catarina, he came up to give a very nice explanation for why what the Dutch had done in attacking and appropriating the Santa Catarina and his cargo was legal. First off, there had been a provision in the VOC charter that we just went through that recognized that indeed the Netherlands were in a state of war with Portugal, because at that point, I guess Portugal had become part of Philip of Spain's empire. So they kind of got dragged into that. And they recognized that Portugal in the Southeast Asia, where the Dutch were trying to sort of get a greater foothold, in some competitive situations, they had interfered with the Dutch establishing a particular trade base here or there. Now, how did they interfere? I don't know. Maybe they burned down their warehouses. Maybe they bribed the local officials to throw them out. All the things that happen in competitive enterprise. So what Hugo Grotius put out this thesis called On the Law of Prize and Booty. And the language from his book, and this is obviously a translation, was such that this is actually a quote from a book about Grotius's book. It said that he identified in his thesis that since Portugal's policy towards the Dutch on the general issue of trade in Asia was one of relentless obstruction, according to Grotius, the act of preventing or actively impeding a party from exercising any one of the rights bestowed by nature is in itself a sufficient legal ground upon which to initiate and wage a just war. So their contention was, we by nature have a right to do trade. And if you attempt to interfere with that right, it is just on our part to defend our right, even if the defense is offensive. And this was an interesting legal theorizing of justifying basically thereupon colonialism. Now, in this case, it was two Japanese. It was two European powers, because of course, before this, no one had felt it compelled to justify all the expropriation they were doing against the countries they were colonizing. But when they went head to head as among themselves, it called into play somebody like Grotius, the States General of the Netherlands, since they had, you know, their Dutch East India Company had precipitated this problem, felt compelled to have an articulated legal justification. And I mention it because, as I said, Grotius, just like joint stock companies and trade, you know, stock trading exchanges, Grotius is still with us in international law. And it started here with the Portuguese Carrac Santa Catarina. So I want to just, that's all really the most I have to say about the interesting nuances of the establishment and the early development, emergence of the Dutch East India Company, and some of its implications that resound even to us today. I thought, you know, it'd be well to take a look at the actual trading routes that they were following. This is another picture by Cornelius Vroom, and this happens to be the picture of the return of the second expedition of Jacob van Neck. And I included this because I think this is apparently a fairly accurate capture of the spirit of the thing. When these ships returned from one of these Dutch East India Company trading excursions, it was a big deal. When they pulled into port, all hands were on deck, because this was enormous amount of cargo coming in. Everybody, you know, now we have all these people who are actually investors, in average people that are invested in these crews. Everybody but wants to see, what have they got? What's the bottom line? Did they make money or lose the money? So these were enormous social events. The entire society would be engaged in these kind of events, the voyages of the VOC.
And
yes,
on this painting, if you can go back for a second, it's dated 1599, so the return was 3 years before the establishment.
You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And this is an example I mentioned in passing that actually voyages had been happening, you know, prior to the establishment of VOC. It wasn't like with VOC, the Dutch went out on their very first trade endeavors. And so good for you, you caught that. And however, I think it does reflect what you know, the reception then would have been even bigger, I think, for the VOC return voyages, at least in the early years.
So it was, this East India Company basically was a formalization of things which started earlier.
That's exactly right. Okay. That's exactly right. With the special added scope of authority that the Dutch East India had. That business about, you know, operating basically as diplomatic representatives, official diplomatic representatives in these colonialized areas of the Dutch Republic. I don't think these earlier business voyages were primarily business. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Mhm.
Okay, thank you. But good catch, good. This is a map that shows generally where the Dutch had a foothold. And as we can see, the Dutch East India Company was in this entire sort of Indonesian area primarily, and ultimately, and also around the area of Portuguese Goa in southern India, with, of course, as we've talked about, the British East India Company would have had the rest of India. The Dutch East India Company also had contacts with the western portion of Australia, but it seems like nobody was paying much attention to, for some reason, Australia was not considered nearly as potentially profitable as these Indonesian islands, where you could have plantations for spices, you had gold, you had, just many lucrative opportunities in that region. You see up here, Japan is also green, or that area, Taiwan there, I think that is. But they also had contact with Japan. I think there is one little green spot up there that you can't quite see that would have been their actual trade post in Japan. And then they were in Cape Town, and that was the primary point of their slave trade activities of enslaved people from Africa. And then the Dutch West Indies, they never really penetrated into Brazil the way it had been hoped they would. They pretty much stayed on the coast, and then also what is known as Dutch Guiana. And then some of the smaller islands in the Caribbean, and then up around New Amsterdam, New York. The rest of these areas in Latin America and the Caribbean, Spanish. So, their footprint on a global map doesn't look that fantastic, but it was enough. And then this map shows the actual trade routes. And they're pretty much what you would expect. It appeared to me that there's three sets of routes. One starts up in the Netherlands, comes down around Africa, Cape Town, then I don't know, there aren't arrows on this, so I don't know what it went, but basically went up to Mauritius, up to these various posts they had, then one up there at some place called Chinchura, through Mallorca, up to Japan, and then would, return back. So that was one sort of standard route. Then you can see the routes here from Africa. There would have been some crossing here, in Cape Town. I assume that if they picked up enslaved people, they could have actually had a handoff around this crossing area here to send people, the enslaved people, to Brazil to work there. Yes.
Yes, sorry. In China, they didn't have any port that they stopped by? I mean, they didn't...
No, not according to these maps. Now, that Chinsura may have been sort of a window onto China. And for example, as I mentioned, that ship, that Portuguese ship was loaded with Ming porcelain. So somebody was trading trading goods with China, but it doesn't look like by the map they actually had a settled trading post there with warehouses and then hinterland plantations the way they did in the Indonesian regions. I don't know why that is.
And one other question is, like, you always, when you look at the paintings from the times in Amsterdam or the Dutch Republic, they have all these carpets from, I guess, Turkey, and doesn't show any connection with that either.
Yeah. Now, I don't know to what extent, you do see in a lot of Dutch paintings, of course, porcelain, blue and white porcelain. And what happened there was that porcelain was so popular that was imported from China that the Dutch started their own porcelain industry. You know, it's called Delftware. So that was an interesting thing. As to the carpets, now some of that may have been coming from India. But they also then would have, you know, they could have just been turning around with their wealth, buying it from Venice, the carpets and things of that nature.
Okay.
You know, because obviously, you know, European trading was alive and well too. And so I do think the Venetians, and as time evolved, the Brits controlled the Mediterranean trade, the Mideastern trade facing the Mediterranean. So yeah, that's a good point though, but that is an interesting thing because part of this prosperity that is reflected so beautifully in by the Dutch Golden Age painters like Rembrandt, like Vermeer, show these luxury goods, this bling that they were either themselves trading or were empowered to acquire from other places in Europe.
And I'm sorry to interject. The only reason I'm interjecting is I'm on Friends of Costume and Textiles at the ROM, and we have a big chintz exhibit. And back to their goods, they were so wanting, especially in Europe, chintz at that time, that they would do anything to get it. And also the silks.
Right, yeah.
And so we were talking about how they brought it in from India, and it was the company, the the West companies, but chintz they just went crazy for chintz.
Yeah, and you know, we mentioned about how the Dutch started their own porcelain industry, Delftware. Similarly, the Florentines, when they realized what a huge demand there was for silk, which they couldn't keep up with the demand, they actually started a major silk industry up there in the area of Florence. So it's a demand supply pull for all of this stuff. But
supply and demand.
You saw on the listing of the cargo that they appropriated on the Santa Catarina. Certainly there was a lot of gold and you know, but there was also damask and silk and pearls, you know, all those kind of beautiful luxury items that these folks in Asia and Southeast Asia, these craftspeople were generating as finished product. It wasn't even raw materials. So yeah, it was, as Mr. Sharma's book, Dr. Sharma's book says, an embarrassment of riches that the prosperity enabled. So now this is kind of the same map, but this just shows a little bit about what the actual commodities were, like we were just talking about. So for example, you see over here in Southeast Asia, pepper, tea, silk, porcelain, cloves, cinnamon, camphor, pepper, sandalwood. And I gather what these traders would do is if the Dutch had a plantation and the blue, or sort of aquamarine color are areas under Dutch control, they might have a big plantation growing pepper or camphor. Some of the surplus that they have, they might actually take to another southeastern point, like in the Philippines, and trade that commodity for something they wanted from the Philippines. So it wasn't all that they just, went to the Southeast Asia, loaded up and turned around and came back. There was a huge sort of commodity trading framework and activity going on among the traders. And that, of course, is true with the Venetian traders as well, and the Brits and everybody else who was engaged. Over in South America, you can see there were sugar plantations that were the big thing. The West Indies, tobacco, North America, tobacco. It's interesting. You see here from Turkey, tulips. Now there, I think, again, that was a cross-Europe trade. I think the tulips were probably coming via Venice. And then, they were, of course, at the same time, trading with Scandinavia and the Baltics for fish and timber and German wheat and all herrings from the North Sea. It was an active trading culture, as it is today.
And how many transportation trucks or boats did they have at the
that is a great question, and I have no idea, but it must have been thousands.
Yeah.
And as I said, normally when a new Dutch East Indies voyage was launched, it wasn't just one vessel. It was a little mini fleet of vessels, maybe 7 that went with, one or two big ones and then some littler ones. So that's a great question. And I'm sure some researcher out there, but the numbers must have been huge because they were the trucks. You're absolutely right of the 17th century and prior to that as well. So at any rate, now I, want to turn a little to the dark side of this, and that is the Dutch Indies enslavement of indigenous people, and it's heartbreaking, it's tragic. And as I said, contemporary Dutch historians are rewriting the history of the golden age narrative to be more sensitive to the actual realities of that goldenness. And this is he looked like by his picture, a young historian, and he says Ludwig Petram, he's an economist and a historian, and he's got a blog out there. And he starts off and he says there's a standard narrative. The Dutch East India Company was a conglomerate whose operations expand, in their most active years, span the 17th and the 18th century. Known for trading spices, American commodities. That's all, we get it, standard narrative. But then, they're adding the insights that the company had a deep and long-lasting impact on the history of Asia, largely in a negative sense. The VOC gained a dominant position in the spice trade by use of force, committed genocide on the Banda Islands, and we'll talk about that episode a little more, made use of slave labor, and also actively traded enslaved people. So fortunately, I think there's a whole area of historical research to be further developed. Not entirely in the judgmental sense, but just in the sense of getting history right and accurate in the sense of completeness, in the sense of giving a full view of what went on. As mentioned, I'm sure there were many massacres, but a famous one was the what's referred to as the Banda Island massacres. When the Dutch went out there, one of their first ports was in Banten, West Java. And shortly thereafter, so this was when they were, again, nosing into that neighborhood, trying to find places probably where the Portuguese were already, entrenched, as the Portuguese were in Goa up in India. which was a massive, massive settlement. In 1611, the Dutch then kind of established in Jakarta, and by established, this means that they kind of set up a fort, started, I guess, buying or appropriating property, starting plantations. It wasn't just that the boat pulled into the dock and said, the locals, do you have anything you want to sell us? They imposed themselves. They were basically colonizing. And in 1610, the VOC actually established this post of Governor General. And the Governor General was in charge of the entire southeast sector of the Dutch East Indies enterprises. And as we saw, the original VOC charter gave authority to the company to engage in armed combat as necessary. But this Governor General was really setting up like a colonial government. It was formulating what had kind of been episodic, defense of a boat or pirating of a boat, as they did in the case of Catarina. This was actually setting up a colonial superstructure. Now, in 1619, this fellow, John Pearson Zoon Cone, was appointed to this post of Governor General. And he apparently was a guy who was like, okay, I'm going to make my name for this. I am really going to establish Dutch hegemony in this area. One of the areas, it entailed moving outward from this foothold they had in Jakarta and appropriating other islands in the region, which meant appropriating the indigenous people there, or intimidating of them, or whatever they were going to do. And the Banda Islands has become emblematic of what the VOC was doing at this point, which was to establish their trade. And this is a little more detailed. This shows the Banda Islands is down there across from the main string of Indonesia. It's still there, known as the bit there, and there's Jan Pieterzoon Cone. At any rate, on October of 1620, Cone wrote to the Governor General of the VOC back in presumably the Netherlands. I beg your pardon. Jan Cone, as the Governor General, wrote to what was called the Heron 17, which is basically the VOC's board of directors, stating to adequately deal with this matter, that's this matter of extending out from their base in Jakarta to the surrounding islands, they were encountering naturally resistance from the indigenous people. He said, it's going to be necessary to once again subjugate Banda and populate it with other people. So they were going to make he was making a big move here. Yeah.
I'm sorry. So the modus operandi was you come to one place, you kill all the people, and you bring people from the outside who doesn't have any idea of the territory or anything, and they're slaves. So that's how you control. And I guess you couldn't charge people who have guns or they have arms to subjugate the people around, right? That was the idea.
Yeah, no, that was the idea. Now, I don't think that's what they did everywhere, but they did it when they felt it was necessary. And so, I think if they felt they could negotiate with the local indigenous, if the local indigenous community leaders kind of,
but what can you negotiate? What did you offer them?
Well,
you have to work for me or you are killed. That's the negotiation, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, with the Manhattan tribal community, there was an exchange of whatever it was, $29. But you're absolutely right. you know, it was a power play where they could. Now these were relatively small tribal communities. This was not India, you know. So I think the intimidation as a technique was particularly if you know, lethally effective here in these instances. And also, I think you probably could say to the people, yeah, if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to decimate you or enslave you and ship you off and replace you. And I'm sure there were people who said, okay, we'll work for you. We don't want to be shipped off. But in the Banda Island situation, the Banda Islanders are basically, no, we're going to fight back. We're not going to let you do that. Whereupon Cone decided, well, we'll just have to go obliterate them, which is basically what he did after he got authorization from the VOC board of directors. So in his mind, it was all legally authorized. At the end of near the end of that same year, the Dutch fleet sailed from Batavia. I'm not exactly sure where Batavia was, but obviously it was somewhere in that neighborhood, a Dutch named foothold of some sort. Well, it was capital of the Dutch East Indies on the north coast of Java, sailed. They had 19 ships, over 1,600 Dutch soldiers. They had Japanese mercenaries. And he led it himself. They then were reinforced by another 250 armed soldiers and 36 native ships. So they had a pretty good force sailing towards the Banda Islands. After they did a couple months of reconnaissance, Cone struck. He ordered an all-out offensive. You know, with their firepower and their manpower, they quickly captured the key strongholds, and the defenders and the local populace fled to what must be geographically, you know, some hills that they hinterland areas they could escape to. But by the end of March, you know, within 2 weeks. The Dutch had pretty much seized control of the entire island. And apparently at that point, a peace was agreed upon of some sort, which must be like, okay, we submit, we'll become your slave laborers on your states here in Banda Island. But there was a continuing ground resistance to their credit. And that Cone just wasn't going to put up with. They basically got some poor souls who they tortured into, quote, confessing that there was an underground conspiracy against them, even though they had control of the island. And, you know, the leaders of the people at least had agreed to a peace. And so Cone proceeded to basically decimate the population of the island. And as you can see, the estimate is that the island population would have been around 4,500 to 5,000 people. 1,700 of whom were killed in the fighting, 1,700 of whom were enslaved, 2,500 of whom died due to, I'm sure they were isolated. They isolated these poor families, etc. Famine and disease, and really tragically, apparently it was a notable thing that even Cone in his reports acknowledged. Many natives just jumped to their deaths from the cliffs in seeing this. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, you finished. Want to finish this up, and I have a little comment on it.
Go ahead. No, I'm finished.
Okay, two things. One is Batavia was the Dutch capital. It's now Jakarta.
Oh, okay.
It remained the capital and took back its Indonesian name or Japanese name of Jakarta. Saying Banda Island was the unique source of nutmeg and mace.
Okay.
Among the most valuable spices. So yeah, this was a fairly small island or islands. It was extremely valuable. It was conquerable. I think, yeah, but as you mentioned, sort of the Dutch could not have done this to the island of Java. And it was much bigger and it wasn't as valuable. Banda Island was the only source of the very valuable spices. Thanks.
Wow, that's great. Well, obviously, that was the dynamic here. But, you know, it's a horror. And this is what the VOC was doing out there. And that, you know, the prosperity back in the Netherlands was predicated on activity like this, you know, hellacious activity like this. That was the Banda Islands Massacre, and I'm sure there were others, but this is one that is well known because Cone reported on it, like, oh, mission accomplished. And what's more, here's a boatload of valuable spices, you know, that's going to enhance everybody's profits, and the stocks are going to go up at the, you know, the Amsterdam stock market. I mentioned, you know, the distinction between slave labor and slave trade. Typically, we do think about slave labor in terms of the African indigenous communities being enslaved and kidnapped and shipped off to South America or North America. But now again, in the evolving historical broadening of study of this era, they are acknowledging that, you know, they're recognizing that, yes, there was slave labor in Southeast Asia. Whoever, you know, was put into place in the Banda Islands was slave labor. So it wasn't all just, you know, it was an across the board thing, and many peoples were engaged. Now, as we said, if you've got a valuable plantation in, for example, Banda, you don't need to you know, trade the slave labor away. You want to keep them at, you know, on that plantation. So I think that's why we have a visibility for the one area. The other thing too is the scope of the slave trading from the trading of enslaved people from Africa is just so mind-blowing. But at any rate, this is, yes.
Sorry,
No.
At the beginning,
Yeah.
I talked about my virtual trip, and it is timely. I went to off the coast of Dakar in Senegal, and they had that island, little island,
Yes.
which they called the home of slaves. And
Right.
it was the Dutch West Company, the French, and it was to get slaves to America.
Yeah, it was
And what they said, and if you look it up, it's Goree Island off Dakar, and they're had a virtual tour out of today, and it was so bad that they said the masters, it would be like a motel where you have the rooms upstairs, and down where the slaves, and you show the weights and the chains there, that the treating these slaves as, and that's what they thought of them, as inhuman beings downstairs suffering.
Oh yeah, it's heartbreaking. I mean, this little piece of paper I have on this slide, you know, that shows, and it was also orderly, you know, that's a horrific part of it to me as well. I mean, here's this little child, an infant, I can't read it quite. Now, this paper I think was really from the 18th century, but same idea. This little child's born, has a name, and is born a slave and registered as such in the Cape of Good Hope Slave Registry Office. But at any rate, you know, that is all now is emerging as part of the story, a big part of the story.
They showed Obama going there to that island.
Well, that's the kind of visibility that's tremendous. So, you know, my little bullet points here, the Dutch East India Company made use of slave labor from early on. One of the governor generals there introduced slave labor into the nutmeg plantations on Ambona in East Indies. And again, this is a situation where the people weren't traded away, but they were enslaved labor in their own indigenous communities. His successor, the infamous John Peter Zoon Cone, introduced slave labor into the rest of the VOC settlements. And this was early, you know, again, the company was established in 1602. Within less than a generation, slave labor was a big part of the equation. And then when Jan van Riebeeck settled in South Africa, the Cape, in 1652, which is a little later, slavery was also already an established way for obtaining labor for the VOC. And so this is just to kind of make that little bit of a nuanced distinction between in situ, in place, enslavement as labor for this company overlord versus the added horror of actually being shipped away. And this picture, I'm sure you all seen this kind of cross section of a slave boat picture. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. It's horrific. Just to note that there's more and more of a contemporary sensibility about this and an awareness and a desire to bring out the truth of all of this and the facts and the scope and the history of it. Is this Twitter from within the past year, where some Twitterer out there is saying, the Dutch West, now this is the West India Company, rate for trade between South Americas and Africa, couldn't make money, as we talked about. They never really displaced the Spanish and the Portuguese in the really lucrative areas of Latin and Central America. So they resorted to slave trade to Brazil, to providing slave labor for the Portuguese and the Spanish, as well as the Dutch and French and everybody else who had plantations there. Yeah.
And I think it's also, if you import someone, first it's easier to control because you are in a place that you don't know anything. And also you are easier to recognize. You're not part of the local population. You look different. So it's impossible to escape. There is no place that you can escape because you don't know the area and you don't know anything. And you look different. So you will always be picked up as a slave. And your kids will be slaves and they will be, forever because you look different.
Oh yeah, the dynamics of it are, hideous and effective. Hideously offensive.
Well, for many, many years, right?
Yeah, and as I said, this is something where, enslavement of indigenous labor in their own original communities is one thing. In order to grow spice, to grow a commodity for you to ship back. This stepping across the line where the human beings themselves were the commodity being traded, that was a far step for sure. And as the little excerpt I picked up from the slaveryremembrance.org website, the Dutch, everybody, the Portuguese were doing it, Spanish were doing it, but the Dutch were doing it too. Their base for the slave trade was, it says they took people to these islands of Curacao and St. Eustatius in the Caribbean. Most of the enslaved people who were landed there, however, were subsequently then transshipped to Spanish colonies. So these islands were like stepping stones. And the numbers are like 500,000 and another 500,000 to other posts. And then they also shipped a huge population of enslaved people from Africa to Dutch Guiana, which is apparently where they actually had company sugar plantations. Now, again, I think
Frozen.
Did Anne disappear? Anne?
And is frozen.
Oh,
She
Okay.
said this was going to happen, that she had having problems with her internet, so she disappears briefly, and she should be back.
I'm back. I'm back. Not to worry.
Frozen, frozen
I may-
time.
Yeah, let me reshare here, get us back on track. Well, just finishing up that obviously this is an area of history that I look forward to seeing, you know, the research to where we just get the fuller history. As I said, again, not in a judgmental sense, although you can't help to react on a human level, but just to let's not have these simple golden age narratives. Let's build those out a little bit where it encompasses the entire experience. So at any rate, now to move on to my story about the real pirates of the Dutch East India Company. We already saw a little bit of what we would consider plundering piratical activity when those Dutch couple of ships appropriated that Santa Catarina. But at that point, it was it apparently was not, it was recognized as an ancillary activity. For the Dutch West Indies companies, private pirating was an accepted adjunct. In other words, these fleets went out specifically for the purpose of pirating Spanish and Portuguese ships. That's what they were there for. They weren't there to trade or anything else. It was pirating. And one of the most famous episodes of this was what's called the Silver Vloot, which apparently translates into treasure ship. But on its face looks more like silver loot, which is what they basically got. And the captain of the successful Dutch West Indies piratical action in this case was this fellow Piet Hines. And he is very well regarded. He's sort of a Dutch hero, although I'm sure your typical contemporary Dutch kid never heard of him. But for a long time, he was sort of a hero. And basically, I want to talk, I'm going to get into the actual Silver Loot episode, but I want to give a little history about Piet Hein because he's sort of an interesting man of the times. He was born in 1577, so sort of right on the cusp of this golden age in Delfhaven, which is apparently near Rotterdam. He was a son of a sea captain. He became a sailor when he was still a teenager. He was captured by the Spanish and served as a galley slave for 4 years. And then he was traded when, I don't know, some trade-off when Dutch were giving up their Spanish galley slaves and the Spanish were trading off their Dutch galley slaves. He was traded back to freedom. When he was about, 23, so he was about 30, he would have been an experienced mariner at this point. He joined the Dutch East India Company and left for Asia. He was a captain. And it says of the Hollandia. I don't know if that was a ship or a unit, one of the Dutch East Indies voyages. But in any event, in 1618, after about 10 years of sailing out on his own, He and his ship were appropriated by the Republic of Venice. I don't even know how that happened, but it did. And he, after about a year of that, just left his vessel behind and traveled back home again, back to the Netherlands, where he was a member of the local government in Rotterdam for a while, married and had children. Now, at this point, the Dutch West India Company, and this was still the first one, initiated this grand plan of initiative to try to seize Brazil, which of course ultimately was not successful. But this is where they were like, okay, we've got to go out. Brazil appears to be this huge, big, rich prize out there, and we've got to displace the Portuguese. And so they kind of ramped up, you know, their ships, their officers, and everything with this kind of focus during this period of time, 1623. And Hein was brought over from the Dutch East India Company and made a vice admiral and sailed off to the West Indies. But again, remember, in this instance, his mission was to pirate Spanish and Portuguese ships, particularly Spanish, because of the area he was in. Oh, by the way, I do want to note that when he was captured by the Spanish, when he was a teenager, he was held in Cuba, and that will actually come into play in the Silver Loop episode. So at any rate, he went across the Atlantic. He tried to capture some merchant ships. He had mixed success, but nevertheless, when he came back from that voyage back to the Netherlands, the Dutch West India powers that be were happy with him, and they sent him back out again with a larger squadron in 1926. And so we've got a guy that's got quite a rollicking background here, it seems to me. He's been through a lot. And apparently, that was your typical mariner of the period, I guess, whether you were Spanish or Dutch or British. Those folks had quite a life. It's amazing they made it past 30, but a lot of them did. So the predicate for this particular episode is that by this time, the Spanish and the Portuguese, as the Dutch as well, had very established trade routes. And here you will see the white lines are Spanish routes, and the blue line are Portuguese routes. And the regularity of these routes meant one thing for a pirate, which is basically what Hines was, even though he was a vice admiral of the Dutch West Indies Company. It meant we can just hang out and wait for the next Spanish fleet to come along, because they come along with, you know, very particular, very predictable regularity. And if we can attack them by surprise or with superior force, it's easy pickings. And so basically, Piet Hein and his little fleet were sent to the Middle East region. So they were going to go for a Spanish ship, because as you can see by these routes, the Spanish operated out of the Caribbean, whereas the Portuguese went more down off of Brazil. So Hines ships off, and he's lurking around Havana. And basically what happens is that in 1628, which I guess was just a year, let's see, let me go back. A year into that particular voyage that he was on, he joined up with another fleet that was already there under the direction of Admiral Heinrich Lunk. and also still another Dutchman, Joost Bankert. So they had themselves quite a firepower they were assembling there. And also, and I don't know why, this guy kind of makes my hair stand on end a little, the back of my neck. The pirate Moses Cohen Ulrichs. I don't think that's a guy I, for some reason, would want to meet in a dark alley. I just picture him as being, I mean, Piet Hein may have been dressed up like an officer, but I got a feeling Moses Cohen Ulrichs was one tough looking character. So at any rate, what they did was they lurked there in the Caribbean, just off of Havana, and sure enough, along comes a Spanish fleet, a galleon, and several smaller ships, and the Dutch fleet confronted them. They didn't even attack them really, and the Spanish basically said, "We give up," and the Dutch sequestered them in this little bay of Mencia, I think it's called, just in the vicinity of east of Havana. They herded them all in there, boarded them. Basically, since they capitulated, they just basically said, "Well, we're taking over these ships, and we're all gonna sail back to the Netherlands, and you know, your cargo is now the property of the Dutch West Indies Company." Well, it turns out that particular Spanish fleet was one of the richest booties ever captured by any pirate anywhere. Now, it's hard to put it in contemporary terms, but it was at least almost 1 million guilders, and 1 million of everything must be a lot, in booty, gold, silver, and of course, the luxury trade commodities of the West, such as indigo and cochineal, which I'm not quite sure that was. But again, no bloodshed. And in point of fact, the Spanish were surprised because when Piet Hein boarded them as an officer, you know, as the commanding officer taking over this capitulation, he could speak Spanish. And the reason he could speak Spanish was because he'd been a Spanish galley slave in Cuba. And apparently, with regard to the crew, the excess crew that I guess they didn't need to get all the ships and cargo back to the Netherlands, they just shuttled them back to the mainland and let them walk away, the excess Spanish fleet. So it was a very bloodless thing, but it was a huge appropriation. And in point of fact, to give some notion of the extent of it, a typical Dutch worker made about 300 Dutch citizen made about 300 guilders a year. Now this was valued at 11, almost 12 million guilders. So, you know, by my math, that's like what 30,000 workers would have made in a year, equivalent value. It included 177 pounds. I actually think it was more than that. I picked that up and I thought, I read someplace else it was much, much more than that. Of silver, thousands of pearls, the typical. At any rate, it was enough to enable the Dutch, who were still in the 80 Years' War with Spain, to fund their army for 8 months, which was enough to sort of turn the tide of the 80 Years' War. The shareholders got a cash dividend of 50%, which is not bad. And the financial loss on the other side of the ledger for the Spanish was so great that it substantially weakened their capacity to pay their military forces fighting the Dutch. So it's quite the remarkable achievement. It is legendary in Dutch history. He came back to the Netherlands and died a famous man in his own time.
And
yeah,
I'm sure that the same story is told totally different by the Spanish, you know, because this is, you know, I'm sure that it's,
I'm sure, yeah, I'm right. They probably don't
I'm
even,
sure that they are the winners and they were this and that, yeah.
I don't know about that, but they might kind of be silent on it. But anyway, yeah, and apparently like one of the Dutch soccer teams actually has their soccer team song incorporates references to Piet Hein. So he's a big deal in Dutch fable.
History.
Yeah, and this is interesting. There is a YouTube, if you happen to speak Dutch, there's a YouTube video out there that this is, you know, this picture is a part of the video they filmed actually in Cuba, looking out over that bay, and that statue right there is a statue of Piet Hein in Cuba. So I think it was there because, you know, it was a bloodless capture by repute. But I love that car too. I wanted to have that picture.
And
So yeah,
I'm having a little laugh because one of the booties was indigo, which is a plant, which they, again, going back to my textiles, which they needed for the dye for blue. And there you got it, the blue car.
yeah, and indigo is still very valuable.
Yes.
That color of blue is highly prized, and as you know, when it's legacy textiles, to have it actually the blue be actual, you know, indigo blue is extremely notable. So at any rate, that's one of the most famous of the real pirates of the Dutch Indies companies. Before I knew about Piet Hein, I thought of pirates as being like that you know, Moses Henri character, you know, like the movies, you know, just wild men. But actually, it was the Dutch company men that were the pirates.
And this is
yes.
the time where the British were also doing pirates, right? I
They
mean,
were, but everybody was doing it, but apparently the Dutch were the best at it.
Okay.
Whenever they do anything, apparently they try to do it the most methodically and efficiently. Which brings us to the end, and New Netherlands and New Amsterdam. This is a nice picture of what New Amsterdam looked like. It's one of my favorite tricks with young people to say, if when they say, you know, they say, what kind of name is Vroom? And, you know, I make them guess, and they guess, oh, it's Estonian, or it's Turkish. I go, no, it's Dutch. And they're like, and then they go, and then I say, and actually my ancestors came to New York before New York was New York. And that draws a complete blank because it's not widely recognized that New York was originally New Amsterdam. And this is a picture of it. And for all you New Yorkers, it certainly is back in the day, because it doesn't look like that anymore, although the geography is still the same, which is really quite astonishing when you think about it. This picture, of course, is quite idyllic. You know, you have the local indigenous populations happily paddling along there with the you know, the actual trade, the Dutch trade ships. You know, there's a big windmill, which is apparently was actually there, was a notable landmark, and all the sort of, the other characteristic of the Dutch is that they urbanize. So you can see, for example, they set up a little town where the folks live in their town houses, and then everybody apparently generally had farm patches in the hinterland. So they didn't tend to move out and live on their farms. They tended to live in their little urbanized communities, and, you know, everyone drew on the agricultural land as a support system. So that's another characteristic of the Dutch. They love to aggregate in little towns rather than living out all by themselves. This is a contemporary painting, which I thought was really quite nice. And just to wrap things up, I just kind of pick the 5-minute history of the Dutch in New Amsterdam / New Netherlands. New Netherlands was the larger New York Hudson Valley territory. In 1634 is about when the first colonizers, if you want to call them that, were put there. It grew up on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. 1626 is when there was the famous exchange of giving the Manhattan Algonquin tribe $24 to buy Manhattan, which may or may not be true, but it wasn't long, as this history says, which is from the History.com website, that the Manhattans wised up and started sort of a constant skirmishing with the Dutch. They were never quite quiet in their property holding, the Dutch were. And so there was some that evolved into, in 1641, sort of protracted war, which I think basically meant if you went outside of the established limits of the various townships like New Amsterdam, then you could expect to encounter, possibly encounter some little armed skirmish with the indigenous peoples. In 1664, which was not that long a holding, only 30 years, New Amsterdam actually passed to English control. At this point, the Brits were moving down from their Boston, Massachusetts, New England enclaves and basically, doing their own appropriation of Dutch settlements. And apparently by that time, the settled Dutchmen who were there weren't that happy with their own governor, Stuyvesant. So they pretty much just turned around to the Brits and said, okay, fine, we'll be British. And New Amsterdam became New York in honor of the Duke of York. So that was that. This is just some fun pictures of, the Dutch were, very methodical about record keeping. So there was a huge number of records, all the people who, what voyage they came on, when they arrived, what property they had, what church they belonged to, who were their children, where did their children go. So I know in New York State, for example, there's huge archives of these records from New Amsterdam, and people can make wonderful maps and stuff because the archival information is so extensive. And that over there is a picture. Apparently, there is somebody who actually does a tour of the remnants of Dutch New Amsterdam, and there must be this metal map somewhere in Lower Manhattan. But I included that because that wall that you see is, of course, the origin of Wall Street. So there you go. And finally, last but not least, I started off with pointing out that Vroom is a real name. There were real Vrooms. It's not just a joke name. That the famous Cornelius Vroom maritime painter who never left the Netherlands. But one of the New Amsterdam settlers was Cornelius Peterson Vroom, who was born in Holland but died in New Amsterdam and had a number of progeny who proceeded to go live in New Jersey and finally down here to Washington. And with that, thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank
Wow,
you,
this
Anne.
was
Great.
That was
Thank you.
great,
Very good.
Anne.
Oh my
Thank
God.
you.
Really good. So,
Well,
Anne, the family tree, how did you know that you connected to this room, or this is just?
Well, actually, you can just Google it. That again is one of the New York State records. You just Google Vroom, and it's like boom. The artist, it was interesting. A few years ago, the National Gallery of Art actually had a installation of Dutch art sponsored by the Dutch embassy here, the Netherlands embassy here in Washington. And some of the art they brought over were these huge canvases by Cornelius Vroom, which was, again, very odd to see the name Vroom, because as I grew up, me and my brother and my sister and my parents, we were like the only Vrooms. And nobody ever heard of any other Vrooms. And it was like, what kind of name is Vroom? And it was like, Vroom, Vroom. You know, that's all you'd ever hear all the time. So it was odd to go into the National Gallery and be like, wow, here's somebody with that name too.
This is amazing, and I can't wait to be posted on the YouTube. This is definitely a treasure.
Well, good. It was a pleasure, and I very much thank everybody for bearing with me as I sort of plow through it all. But
No, that was good, Anne. That was excellent.
Great. And as I said, kind of like when we did the religious orders, the Franciscans and the Benedictines and everybody, my objective is to just sort of give everybody a bit of a framework, a story that kind of puts together some disparate pieces that we all pick up here and there about the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West Company. And so hopefully now everybody has a little better context for what that phenomenon was.
And does the expression going Dutch have anything to do?
Well, I as far as I know, going Dutch means that each party pays for themselves, and I think that's another Dutch characteristic is being kind of tight with money. So it became noticed. Now, interestingly, the Pennsylvania Dutch are not Dutch. They're actually, I believe, either Flemish or German Armenians.
Yes,
and they came over Pennsylvania. They were Pennsylvania Deutsch in the sense of Germans, but it got popularized to Pennsylvania Dutch. But apparently their heritage is not actually Dutch.
I want to do a piece on the Pennsylvania Dutch and Volga River Germans that lived in Russia. They were invited by Catherine the Great. Those are, because there's so many Germans that lived everywhere throughout the world. But those two communities are considered to be, the most, obviously Amish. We'll touch on Amish as well. The three communities that are German descent, but they're kind of peaceful, you can think of.
They're very similar to the Dutch in a way, although they tend to be more rural, with those large prosperous farms. Whereas, like I said, the Dutchmen like to get in towns and start doing trading. But yeah, they're in both of our world wars, the Amish, who I think that's the same as Pennsylvania, what was called Pennsylvania Dutch, were always categorized as conscientious objectors, and then would serve in medical corps and things of that nature. They're totally pacifists.
Yeah, and Zach, on my mother's maternal side, who was a Whistler, they were Pennsylvania Dutch and a lot of people came up to Canada.
Yes, there's a big community in Canada.
Yes.
So there's a huge community in Canada of Pennsylvania Dutch, and some of them resettled from Russia. From German, that lived on the Volga River, resettled from Russia to Canada during the World War I.
Yes.
And that's how they ended up. They also were a pacifist community, didn't participate in either War I or War II. Well, understandably so. Stalin didn't want to get any of them to be participating in World War II because he thought they will, help the Germans, which was not true. And they were eventually deported to my region, Uzbekistan. All the Germans we had German villages in Uzbekistan.
You do?
They raised our farm community. Yeah. Greek and German villages in Uzbekistan.
So they were deported from Russia?
From Volga River, yeah. Catherine the Great invited them in 17th century, and they were the pacifist community coming from Germany to build Russian farmland.
Catherine the Great, of course, was German.
Yes, she was German, yes. So she invited them to build Russian, because Russian farm farm, on the land was not really good. So they invited Germans to raise it. They did raise it to a very high level, but when the World War I happened, they kind of stuck behind in Russia, and they already spoke only Russian, didn't speak any German. It was 300 years already passed, 400 years. And then when Stalin came around, he didn't trust them, and he deported them to Uzbekistan, to the south, so that they'll help the war cause, but at the same time he'll keep an eye on them, because they were German, and he was scared that they will help the Germans.
So they were deported, and what do they give them a piece of land, or
Yeah, they
what
gave them
was
villages. But you can imagine Uzbekistan, the land had to be cultivated, like the people that lived there in the farms were not good farmers to begin with. The Muslim population was mostly rural population, in the cities, and they needed somebody like, between World War I, World War II, which were Greeks and Germans and Tartars, live in the villages, and also Korean. You don't know about that one. Koreans, there's a million Koreans that Stalin was afraid that during the war with Japan, that the Koreans would participate in the war on the side of Japan, and he wanted to deport them to Uzbekistan from Far East. So he deported 1 million Koreans to Uzbekistan. It was a hodgepodge.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a lot of, like, if you go to Forest Hills, you have a lot of Koreans speaking fluent Russian because they all came from Uzbekistan. They're like,
wow. And they came from.
Yeah, they came here. And when they go to Korea, they consider themselves Korean. They consider themselves Russians because they speak only Russian. There's a huge Korean population. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah, I had a lot of classmates. That I went back a year ago, year and a half ago, and I had about 5 classmates that were Korean. In a 35, people class, it was a lot. So, yeah. I mean, I'll do one day thing on Uzbekistan. It's so fascinating. The whole thing is extremely fascinating. You went from a extremely backward Muslim country before the Tsar came, and then when the Tsar came, it still was backward, and then it got industrialized during Tsar, and during the communist time, after deportation of Koreans, German, Tartars, it kind of went to the next level, and then it industrialized, and cities became. I didn't have a hot and cold war up until like 30s. All of it got switched. There was huge, multi-story buildings start building. They were really, there's dams to build. The only problem was it was communism. Obviously, there was no private industry to kind of cultivate it all, and there was no development as far as developing it. But the villages were very self-sufficient. Like German villages, we used to go to German villages to buy chickens, cheese, all that stuff. That's where the goods were, because they knew for 300, 400 years, they built everything in home. They built everything in home. So that's the Greeks we went to also for cheese and all that stuff. So it was unbelievable. And they all kind of went after the Democratic Revolution in 1990s. They all left. So anyway, Anne, I really appreciate it. This was amazing.
My pleasure.
I hope you're doing at least 2 more parasailing, right? And then, or you don't want to do that one?
Which one? About the America's Cup. Now, I don't think you've actually scheduled that, have you?
I did schedule it. I can tell you.
Yeah, you better tell me.
I'm so sorry. I should have.
Thanks again.
You're welcome.
I should have told you about that. I apologize. Let me tell you. I can always reschedule for later time, but American Cops on April 17th, and then you have another one toward the end of April. Not the end of April. You have the
the one about how did Aristotle and Plato get to Europe? When is that scheduled for now?
22nd
of April.
Yeah, so maybe I should move one.
Yeah, move one of them, please, just to give me a little, time to prepare adequately. So right, either so one.
Parasailing to maybe, I'd say June.
Or
you wanted to move Western one.
Let's move the Western, how did Aristotle and Plato get to Europe one to June? And because the America's Cup just finished up, so it'll be a little more timely.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll duly advertise it. This was great. A lot of interest in this. This is amazing. Thank you so much. And I hope
Everyone.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I was just going to wish everyone, it's kind of a holiday weekend for several traditions.
Yes, yes.
And so I wish everyone wonderful observances.
I appreciate it.
Zakar, you all just had Passover, right?
It's ending on Saturday.
Yeah, you're in the 7 days. Yeah.
7 days. Yeah. I mean, we just had it. It was. Yeah. I mean, it's.
Yeah. Well, is it proper to say Happy Passover?
We say Chag Shemeya.
Okay, that I say that.
Akshamia.
Not a happy. It wasn't a happy occasion.
No, that's what I always thought. It seems like that's not quite right.
No, it was not a happy occasion to begin with, but that's okay.
Well, it's okay to say Happy Easter. That works like that. So both, as long as both ways it's respectful, and I hope that again a worthwhile observance for this holy period.
Thursday of June 3rd. How about that?
Okay, great, and then still April 17th for the America's Cup.
Yeah, and I appreciate it so much. I mean,
my pleasure. It's fun, and again, I'm appreciative of everyone's time, very much so.
No, we love it.
Okay, bye-bye, Zach. Bye, Marisha. Bye, Michael.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.